The frozen sea stretched before us like a vast white desert, endless and silent under a sky that held no warmth. We stood at its edge, 23 prisoners and 4 guards, watching as the last ships disappeared beyond the horizon, their sails swallowed by mist. The sea had closed, the ice had formed its bridge, and we had no choice but to cross it, heading toward a destination none of us could see, toward a fate we could only imagine. My name is William, and I was there that morning when we took our first steps onto the ice, when we left behind everything we knew and walked into the white unknown. The cold bit through my worn coat immediately, finding every gap in the fabric, every weakness in my defenses. I was 28 years old, convicted of theft from a merchant's warehouse in London, sentenced to transportation and labor in the far northern territories where Russia kept its most remote penal colonies. But the ship that was meant to take us there had been damaged in a storm, forced to turn back, leaving us stranded at this desolate outpost where the Arctic Ocean froze solid each winter. The guards had decided we would walk across the ice to the mainland settlement, a journey of perhaps 60 miles, rather than wait months for another ship. If you find yourself drawn to stories of survival against impossible odds, of human resilience in the harshest environments on Earth, and of the bonds that form when people must depend on each other to live, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. These stories of contemplative survival will take you to places few have seen, teach you lessons few have learned, and show you the quiet strength that exists in all of us. Now, let me tell you how we survived. We were not prepared for this journey. Most of us were city men, familiar with cobblestones and crowds, not ice and isolation. Our clothing was inadequate, our provisions limited to what could be carried on our backs, our knowledge of survival in such conditions non-existent. The guards who accompanied us were hardly better prepared, though they carried weapons and an arrogant certainty that authority would somehow protect them from the cold. But there were others with us. 4 men who had been brought from a coastal village to serve as guides, men who knew the ice, who had lived their entire lives in this frozen world. Their leader was a man named Alexei, perhaps 50 years old, with a weathered face that showed the marks of countless winters and eyes that seemed to see through fog and snow to truths the rest of us couldn't perceive. He spoke little Russian, and we spoke none of his language, but he communicated through gestures and demonstrations, through patience and a quiet confidence that made even the guards defer to him. With Alexei were his nephew Dmitri, a young man of perhaps 20 who served as a bridge between our worlds, speaking enough Russian to translate when necessary. There was also Katya, a woman of 40 whose husband had died on the ice the previous winter, who knew more about survival than any of us would ever learn. And there was old Fyodor, a man so ancient his exact age was unknowable, who carried stories and wisdom from generations past. We set out at dawn on a Tuesday in November. The sun barely cleared the horizon, casting long shadows across the ice, turning the world into a study of blues and whites and grays. The sound of our footsteps was muffled, absorbed by the snow that covered the ice in uneven drifts. I walked near the middle of our column, between a Scottish forger named Robert, who had become my friend during our weeks at the outpost, and a silent Russian named Ivan, who had killed a man in a tavern brawl and never spoke of it. The first hour was almost peaceful in its strangeness. The ice seemed solid, the way ahead clear, the sky holding a pale beauty I had never seen in England's grey cities. But then the wind began to rise, and with it came an understanding of what we faced. The cold here was not the damp chill of London winter. It was a savage thing, absolute and unforgiving, that found every exposed bit of skin and turned it numb, that made breathing painful, that sapped strength and will with every passing minute. Alexei raised his hand and we stopped. He spoke to Dmitri, who translated for us. We rest. 5 minutes, no longer. Keep moving your fingers and toes. Do not sit on the ice. It seemed like obvious advice, but I saw several men already preparing to sit, their exhaustion overwhelming their judgment. Alexei moved among us, demonstrating how to stamp our feet, how to swing our arms, how to keep blood flowing. He had brought us to a halt not because we needed rest, but because he had seen the signs of cold taking hold, had known we needed to learn this lesson before the ice taught it more harshly. As we resumed walking, I watched Alexei more carefully. He moved across the ice with a particular rhythm, his steps neither hurried nor slow, his attention constantly scanning the environment. He was reading the ice, I realized, seeing things in its surface that were invisible to me. Cracks that indicated weakness, textures that suggested different thicknesses, shadows that revealed hidden pressures and stresses in the frozen sea beneath our feet. What I didn't know then was that Alexei had already saved our lives 3 times in that first hour, steering us around dangers we couldn't see, avoiding routes that would have led to disaster. The ice was not the solid, stable surface it appeared. It was alive in its way, shifting with currents and tides, groaning with internal pressures, creating and erasing pathways in a constant evolution we prisoners could not comprehend. By midday, the guard's authority had begun to erode. The head guard, a brutal man named Sokolov, who had enjoyed his power over us at the outpost, tried to order Alexei to increase our pace. Alexei simply looked at him, said something in his own language, and continued at the same steady rhythm. Dmitri translated quietly for those near enough to hear. He says the ice sets the pace, not men. To hurry is to die. Sokolov's face flushed with anger, but he said nothing more. He had already learned, as we all were learning, that his weapons and his rank meant nothing here. The ice did not care about authority. The cold did not respect position. In this place, knowledge was the only power that mattered, and Alexei held that knowledge like a key to our survival. That night, Alexei taught us how to make camp on the ice. He showed us how to build windbreaks from blocks of snow, how to arrange our bodies to share warmth, how to protect our supplies from the wind that never seemed to stop. Katya distributed small portions of dried fish and hard bread, showing us how to melt snow for water using heat from our own bodies, rather than wasting precious fuel. Old Fyodor sat in the center of our makeshift camp and began to tell a story. Dmitri translated, his voice soft in the darkness. Long ago, when the world was young and the ice was new, there was a man who became lost on the frozen sea. He walked for days, seeing nothing but white in every direction, feeling the cold take him piece by piece. He was ready to lie down and let the ice claim him when he saw a fox, white as the snow, watching him. The fox turned and began to walk, and the man followed. For 3 days and 3 nights they traveled, the fox always ahead, always visible, always leading. And finally they reached land and safety. The man never saw the fox again, but he understood that the ice had chosen to spare him, that he had been given a second chance, and he spent the rest of his life teaching others how to respect the frozen sea, how to read its signs, how to cross it safely. The story settled over us like a blanket. In its simple narrative was a lesson we were all learning. Survival here required more than strength or courage. It required observation, respect, and the humility to follow those who knew better. I looked at Alexei, sitting quietly at the edge of our camp, his eyes on the horizon where darkness met darkness. He was our fox, I thought, our guide through the white maze, and we would either follow him or perish. The second day was harder than the first. The novelty had worn off, replaced by the grinding reality of exhaustion, cold, and fear. My feet had developed blisters despite Katya's advice to double-wrap them in cloth. My fingers were numb, no longer fully responding to commands from my brain. And the wind had increased, carrying with it a stinging snow that reduced visibility to a few yards. Alexei adjusted our formation, bringing us closer together, creating a line where each person could see the one ahead and behind. He placed his strongest walkers at the front to break the wind, rotated positions every hour so no one bore the worst of it for too long. These were strategies he had learned over a lifetime, knowledge passed down through generations, refined through trial and error and the harsh judgment of the ice itself. Around mid-morning, young Dmitri fell through the ice. One moment he was walking ahead of me. The next, he had simply disappeared with a crack and a splash. The line stopped instantly, everyone frozen in shock and fear. But Alexei was already moving, pulling a coiled rope from his pack, securing one end around his own waist and moving toward the hole where Dmitri had fallen. "Don't run!" Katya shouted in Russian, then in broken English for those of us who needed it. "Spread out. Distribute weight." We obeyed instinctively, moving apart, lying flat on the ice as she directed. Alexei reached the edge of the hole and lowered the rope into the black water. Seconds felt like hours. Then Dmitri's hand emerged, grasping the rope, and Alexei began to pull. Robert and I crawled forward to help, adding our strength to Alexei's, hauling Dmitri from the water that would have killed him in minutes. The young man emerged gasping, his clothes already beginning to freeze, his skin pale and his lips blue. Katya was there immediately, stripping off his wet clothing despite the cold, wrapping him in every spare bit of fabric we could spare, forcing hot liquid down his throat from a flask she had kept warm against her body. We couldn't stop, couldn't make camp. To stop with wet clothing was to die. So we walked, surrounding Dmitri, sharing our body heat, keeping him moving while his clothes dried slowly in the savage wind. It took 3 hours before color returned to his face, before his shaking subsided from violent to merely constant. And in those 3 hours, I learned something profound about survival. It was communal or it was impossible. Alone, Dmitri would have died. Together, we kept him alive. That night, old Fyodor told another story. "The ice is not our enemy," Dmitri translated, his voice still weak but recovering. "It is a teacher. It shows us what we are made of, what we can become. Every person who crosses it is changed. Some are broken, some are strengthened, but none are unchanged. The ice strips away pretense and shows us truth." I thought about those words as I lay shivering in the darkness, pressed between Robert and Ivan for warmth. I had been a thief in London, a man who took what didn't belong to him because I believed the world owed me something. That man seemed very small now, very foolish. The ice didn't care about my grievances or my justifications. It only cared whether I was strong enough, smart enough, humble enough to survive it. The third day brought a storm. It swept across the ice with terrifying speed, reducing visibility to nothing, turning the world into a chaos of wind and snow. Alexei immediately ordered us to form a tight circle, linking arms, creating a human structure that could resist the wind's attempts to separate and scatter us. For 6 hours we stood like that, barely able to breathe against the driving snow, unable to see even the person next to us, held together only by touch and will. It was in that storm, standing blind and frozen, that I felt something shift inside me. I was no longer William the thief, William the prisoner, William the outsider. I was simply William, one human among many, fighting to survive, dependent on the strangers around me, just as they depended on me. The distinctions that had seemed so important, guard and prisoner, Russian and English, free and enslaved, all melted away in the face of the ice's indifference. When the storm finally passed, we discovered we had drifted slightly off course. Alexei studied the stars that emerged in the cleared sky, conferred with Katya and Fyodor, then adjusted our heading. I asked Dmitri how they knew where we were, how they could possibly navigate across a featureless expanse with no landmarks, no signs, nothing but endless white. He smiled slightly and said, "Alexei knows. He reads the ice like you would read a book. Every ridge, every shadow, every quality of the snow tells him something. And the stars, when we can see them, they never lie." By the 5th day, we had lost 3 men. One guard who had refused to follow Alexei's advice about conserving energy, who had pushed too hard and collapsed, his heart giving out from the strain. 2 prisoners who had wandered off during a rest stop, convinced they saw something in the distance, found frozen the next morning despite our search. Each loss was marked with a moment of silence, a few words, and then we continued. We had to continue. To stop was to join them. But something else was happening too. The surviving prisoners and guards were becoming indistinguishable. We shared food without hierarchy. We took turns breaking wind at the front of our column. We slept in a shared mass of bodies, seeking warmth without regard to status. Even Sokolov, the brutal guard, had become simply another man struggling to survive. His authority forgotten, his weapons put aside in favor of the more practical burden of extra blankets. I found myself walking beside Alexei one afternoon. He pointed to the ice ahead and said something to me in his language. I didn't understand the words, but I understood he was teaching me something. He knelt and showed me how to read the slight discoloration that indicated thin ice, how to feel the subtle vibrations that suggested hidden cracks, how to test uncertain areas with a staff before trusting your weight to them. I practiced what he showed me, and he nodded in approval when I identified a weak spot he had been steering us around. That evening, Katya gave me a gift. It was a pair of mittens she had made from scraps of fur and fabric, lined with moss that somehow held warmth. She said nothing, just pressed them into my hands and moved on to her next task. But I understood what the gesture meant. I was no longer an outsider. I was becoming one of them, someone worth caring for, someone whose survival mattered. On the 7th day, we saw land. A dark line on the horizon, barely visible through the mist, but unmistakably solid ground rather than ice. A cheer went up from our group, the first sound of pure joy any of us had made in a week. But Alexei held up his hand for silence. He spoke at length, and Dmitri translated grimly. The last stretch is the most dangerous. The ice near shore is unstable, broken by tides and currents. We must move very carefully, test every step, stay close together. Men have died within sight of land because they rushed, because they thought they were safe. We are not safe until our feet touch rock. The warning sobered us, turned celebration into cautious determination. We approached the shore over the course of 3 hours, moving at a crawl, testing every foot of ice, distributing our weight as Alexei directed. Twice we had to backtrack when the ice proved too thin to support us. Once we heard a deep boom as a section of ice calved away somewhere nearby, reminding us that the frozen sea was always moving, always changing, always dangerous. But finally, as the sun touched the horizon, Alexei stepped onto rock. Then Katya, then Fyodor, then Dmitri, then the rest of us, one by one, leaving the ice behind and standing on solid ground for the first time in 8 days. We had crossed the frozen sea. We had survived. That night we made camp on land, with stone beneath us instead of ice, with the sound of wind through scrub brush instead of the endless silence of the frozen ocean. Fyodor told one final story. There is an old saying among our people, Dmitri translated. The ice gives and the ice takes. It has taken from us 3 men who will not see their homes again. But it has given us something too. It has shown us what we are capable of. It has shown us that we are stronger together than apart. It has taught us respect and humility and patience. These are gifts, if we are wise enough to accept them. I sat by the fire, looking at the faces around me illuminated by firelight. Robert, my Scottish friend who had shared his meager rations when mine ran out. Ivan, the silent Russian who had given me his extra pair of socks when mine froze solid. The guards, who were no longer guards but fellow survivors, and Alexei, Katya, Dmitri, and Fyodor. The ones who had saved us all, who had shared their knowledge and their resources without asking anything in return. Why did you help us? I asked Dmitri. We're prisoners. You owed us nothing. He was quiet for a moment, then spoke without translating for the others. My uncle says that on the ice there are no prisoners and no guards. There are only people, and people must help each other, or none survive. This is the oldest law, older than kings and courts and crimes. The ice taught us this, and we teach it to others. The settlement where we were supposed to report was still 2 days' walk inland, but those days passed almost easily after our crossing. When we finally arrived, the commandant was shocked to see so many of us alive. He had not expected the crossing to be attempted, had assumed we would winter at the outpost and arrive in the spring. He began to assign us to work details, to reimpose the hierarchy of prisoner and guard, to return us to the roles we had left behind on the ice. But something had changed, something that couldn't be undone simply by arriving at our destination. The men who had crossed the ice together had formed bonds that imprisonment couldn't fully break. We worked side by side regardless of our official status. We shared what little we had. We looked out for each other in ways that confused and sometimes annoyed the authorities who tried to maintain order through separation and control. Alexei and his people stayed at the settlement for 2 weeks before beginning their journey home. On the day they left, I stood with the other prisoners to see them off. Alexei approached me and placed his hand on my shoulder. He spoke, and Dmitri translated one last time. You learned well. You listened. You respected what you did not understand. If you ever need to cross the ice again, you will know how. And if you ever find yourself back in the green lands where you came from, remember what the white land taught you. Remember that survival is not about strength alone, but about wisdom, cooperation, and respect. I watched them disappear into the distance, 4 figures growing smaller against the vast landscape, heading back toward the frozen sea they called home. I wondered if I would ever see them again, and I knew somehow that I would not. But they had given me something that would last far longer than our brief time together. A different understanding of who I was and what I was capable of becoming. The months that followed were hard. The work in the settlement was brutal, the conditions harsh, the treatment of prisoners often cruel. But I found that I could endure it in ways I couldn't have before crossing the ice. I had learned patience. I had learned that survival was a matter of small, careful choices accumulated over time rather than dramatic gestures. I had learned to help others even when it cost me something, because I had seen how that mutual support kept everyone alive. Years passed. My sentence was eventually completed, and I was given the choice to return to England or to remain in Russia as a free man. I surprised myself by choosing to stay. I had developed a strange affection for this harsh land, and, more importantly, I had skills now that were valuable here. I knew how to survive winter. I knew how to read ice and snow. I knew the old stories Fyodor had told, the lessons Alexei had taught, the quiet strength Katya had demonstrated. I settled in a small village near the coast and began to work as a guide, helping others cross the ice safely, teaching them the lessons I had learned. I married a local woman, had children, built a life that would have been unimaginable to the bitter young thief who had left London years before. I never saw Alexei again, but I heard news of him occasionally. He continued to guide travelers across the ice well into his 60s, saving countless lives with his knowledge and patience. I am an old man now, nearly 70, sitting by my fire as another winter settles over the land. My children are grown, my wife has passed, and the ice beckons one more time. But tonight I am thinking about that crossing 42 years ago, about the 8 days that changed everything, about the moment when I stopped being a prisoner and became simply a man among men, fighting to survive, learning to live. The ice gives and the ice takes. It took 3 men from our group, took the arrogant certainty I had carried like armor, took the bitterness and selfishness that had defined me for so long. But it gave me so much more. It gave me Alexei's wisdom, Katya's strength, Dmitri's patience, Fyodor's stories. It gave me an understanding of what humans can endure and achieve when they work together. It gave me a second life, a better life, a life I could be proud of. Tomorrow, a young man is coming to see me. He has been convicted of some minor crime and is being transported north, and someone told him to seek out the old Englishman who knows the ice. I will teach him what I can. I will tell him Fyodor's stories, demonstrate Alexei's techniques, share Katya's small kindnesses. I will try to give him what was given to me. A chance to become more than what he was, to learn that we are all capable of change, that the harshest environments can be the greatest teachers. The fire crackles, and outside the window the snow falls soft and steady, covering the world in white. The frozen sea is forming again, as it does every year, creating its bridge between land and land, between past and future, between who we were and who we might become. And somewhere out there, I imagine, there are other travelers preparing to cross it, other prisoners and guards learning the ancient lesson that, on the ice, we are all simply human. If this story of survival, transformation, and the bonds that form in the harshest places has touched you, please subscribe to this channel. These stories matter. They remind us that we are capable of more than we know, that the hardest journeys often lead to the greatest growth, that we survive not alone, but together. Share this with someone who needs to hear that change is possible, that wisdom comes from unexpected places, that we are all teachers and students in the great school of life. And remember, as you go about your comfortable existence, that somewhere, always, there are people crossing their own frozen seas, learning their own hard lessons, becoming their own better selves. May we all have the courage to make such crossings. May we all find our Alexius to guide us, and may we all remember to reach back and help the next traveler who needs to cross the ice.